Please enjoy the session, and I'm going to hand over to Dr. Warren Larkin.
Thank you, Marcia. Much appreciated. I just took a little screenshot of the current ratings where people feel they are, which is good. So lots of people feel they already know something about this subject, which is great. I hope I can bring some additional perspective to it. So I'm gonna start. I've set my timer off so I know how long I've got. So today's session, when it arrives, it's called Trauma and Resilience Informed Practice. So I add the word resilience in there because it's not, you can't really talk about trauma without talking about resilience as well. They're like two sides of the same coin. And I do think it can change the way we deliver care, the way we parent our kids, the way we do our relationships. It can change a lot of things in the world for the better, I think. So that's why I've given it this title. Excuse me. So we've got to remember as well that trauma, people talk about trauma all the time and often don't think about the fact that we're talking about a kind of stress. Trauma is a kind of stress that creates harm, that leads to harm for people. But the original concept of stress was an engineering term. It wasn't used in human services before the 50s when Hans Selye wrote The Stress of Life. He was an endocrinologist. Pub quiz fact, he was nominated for the Nobel Prize 17 times, but he never won it, which was a shame. Anyway, back to the main agenda. He talked about stress being, he used the term from engineering and he adapted it really. And in engineering, it meant the effect of force acting against resistance. So when do things kind of bend and then collapse? When do they break? When do they stop working? So he went on to do lots of experiments and look at the stress response in animals and humans, and he described it as a biological and psychological phenomena and went on to outline his general adaptation syndrome. So what happens to the body and the mind when we're faced with challenges? The kind of challenges and the kind of stress we're talking about today is the kind of stress that leads to injury, traumatization, and when stress becomes toxic. And that happens when the demands on us as an organism exceed our capacity to deal with them. So that's where we have the two sides of the scales, you know, traumatic or injurious stress on this side and our resilience and coping abilities on this side. And when the stress demands exceed our coping and resilience capacity, that's when we become harmed by it. I don't often have to do this, but the sun is too bright. I just have to adjust the blinds there. So let's talk about traumatic stress. We have to think about a definition. There are lots of definitions. I like this one from SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration in America. They describe traumatic or injurious stress. So the word trauma means injury or wound. So we're talking about a kind of mental injury or wound. They talk about it as an event or series of events or set of circumstances experienced by an individual as either physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects. So I put that in bold because that's a key differentiating factor. It has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning, whether that be mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual. If it doesn't have lasting adverse effects, then it's probably not traumatic. It's probably highly stressful, highly unpleasant, really difficult. If people bounce back pretty quickly, if they're not left with lasting problems, it's potentially not traumatic. So we have to remember that that's part of the differentiation between a kind of state of disease and a state of kind of normal recovery. So another example of this concept, Bessel van der Kolk wrote the book The Body Keeps the Score, which is obviously a very famous book on this subject. But he made this statement a few years ago, and I really like it because I think it sums up the key points. He said traumatization, i.e. the harm that occurs, happens when our internal and external resources, i.e. our resilience and coping, are inadequate to cope with the external threat. So he clearly read Selye's book and it clearly had influence on him. And I put those scales there because it is really about this balancing act between stress, trauma, tragedy and loss over here, resilience, coping, support, ways of adapting over here. And if something lands on this side that's massively stressful and it's overwhelming and it's too much for us to cope with our current assets and resources, the scales will tip and the chances are we will become unwell physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, or in our relationships. And then the task is, how do we rebalance this? So we could remove some of this burden, reduce the stress, deal with the trauma, get psychological therapies, or we could work on this side and work on our social support and our how we look after our body and our mind and use our ways of adapting and coping. And by doing both of those things, we can get back into balance. But unfortunately, much of the time, people don't get access to psychological therapists because they're in scarce supply, which is a shame. So often we end up, as professionals and practitioners, helping people with this side. Actually, we end up helping people build their social support, build their ways of adapting and navigating different ways, building up their resources and assets. And one of the most important assets is social support. Actually, we'll come back onto that. So they're the ways that we can recover balance. And actually, it can be about reducing the burden here, or it can be about increasing our assets and coping and adaptation on this side. So that's a really crucial concept that I want you to hold on to today. So this is a slide from a study by the World Health Organization, funded by the World Health Organization in 2015. It looked at 24 countries, 69,000 people, 29 different kinds of traumatic events, potentially traumatic events. And what they found was 70% of people experienced, on average, 70% of people experienced at least one event that would fit with DSM-4 at the time, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. 70% of people have at least one event. Most people recover. 70 to 80% of people recover naturally without any help, without any professional help, over a course of time. 20 to 30% of people don't recover after a single event. We also know that around 30% of people from this study reported that they'd had at least 4 or 5 types of traumatic event. Things like witnessing death, serious injury, unexpected death of a loved one, being mugged, having a life-threatening accident in a car, a life-threatening injury or illness. These kinds of things were the things that they were endorsing when they said, yes, I've had one of those things, or I've had 4 or more of those things. One of the most interesting findings from this study was that the thing that predicted recovery and people staying well after a traumatic event was social support. So people that were married tended to do better in terms of recovery, and people who didn't have good social support tended not to recover as well. So social support is absolutely one of the most common findings in this kind of research. It does tend to predict recovery, whereas absence of social support tends to predict ongoing problems. So there's another kind of trauma that we need to talk about, really, which is adverse childhood experience. Really, it's kind of developmental trauma, because we're talking about things that happen often in the home, but when children are growing up. So the things that this concept of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, was originally sort of laid down in 1998 by Vincent Felitti and Robert Ander in their original ACE study. They looked at 10 different kinds of childhood adversity. So physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse, living in a home where someone is addicted to drugs or alcohol, living with domestic abuse, having a parent or carer who goes to prison or who has a serious mental health problem, or parental loss, and finally neglect. So they looked at those 10 categories. Obviously, that's not an exhaustive list. There are other things that happen to children growing up that can be harmful, but these are the things that were studied most extensively and famously in this study by Felitti and Ander. What that study told us, above all else, I think, was that there was a very strong relationship between the amount of harmful stress that children are exposed to growing up, those 10 categories of adversity, and their outcomes later on in life. So they found that there was a strong and proportionate dose-response relationship. So bigger the dose of adversity growing up before the age of 18, higher the risk of all kinds of physical, mental, and social problems later on. And that relationship, that dose-response relationship, has been found in over 40 population-based studies since 1998. So pretty much every epidemiological study that looks for this relationship, they find it. So it's really stable and really predictable. Bigger the dose of toxic stress, worse problems later on in life, as a rule. On an individual level, if you've had lots of adversity, it doesn't mean that you're not going to have good outcomes in life, that you're going to be healthy and have brilliant relationships and be a fantastic parent. It doesn't mean that, because the relationship between adversity here and coping here still stands. If you've had lots of adversity in childhood, but also lots of protective factors, you can be completely healthy, completely fine without all of those problems that I'm going to tell you about in a minute. So this is population research. In England, about half the population said they've had at least one ACE, with 10%, 1 in 10 people across England and Wales saying they've had 4 or more of that list of childhood adversities. And what we know about adversity in the life course is that people with more adversity compared to people who haven't had any, people with more adversity tend to have more chronic illnesses. They tend to have higher rates of cancer, heart disease, diabetes, inflammatory conditions, autoimmune conditions, respiratory illness, mental health problems. They tend also to have more exposure to violence and actually perpetrate more violence. People with more adversity compared to those who have none also tend to do worse in education, more likely to be excluded, more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system, tend to use more healthcare resources, more emergency services. The list goes on, really. So the best solution is, let's prevent, where possible, adversity happening to children. And where it has happened, let's intervene as early as we can. And part of that means being able to ask people in a sensitive way what's happened to them. And I've been advocating for this for nearly 30 years, and it's still not common practice. We rarely ask people about that list of 10 adversities as part of our assessment. It's usually some sort of catch-all question like, was anything traumatic happen to you, or did anything bad happen in your childhood, or tell me about your childhood, how was it? And these things are very vague. It's not clear to people that we're asking them specifically about abuse, neglect, violence, etc. So I'll come back onto that later. The original Felitti study found that 4 or more adversities growing up before the age of 18 increased the odds of somebody experiencing addiction to drugs by 5 times, 7 times more likely to be addicted to alcohol, and 12 times more likely to attempt suicide. And then the English ACE study, 20 years later, or just over 20 years later, found similar things. So people with 4 ACEs compared to those who had none were 6 times more likely to have had or caused an unplanned teenage pregnancy, 7 times more likely to have been the victim or perpetrator of violence in the last 12 months, and 11 times more likely to use crack or heroin or go to prison. So this is incredibly powerful information. These exposures in childhood to toxic kinds of stress are influencing the way they cope later on, the way people cope later on. And often those coping strategies, or those lack of coping strategies, lead to health harming consequences. If we look at the study on the right, which is a prospective study of 8,199 adolescents who didn't have any clinical diagnosis when they were first studied, and then 12 to 14 years later, they were followed up as adults. And what was discovered is that anybody with a history of adversity, any amount of adversity, 1 or more, if they reported that when they were first interviewed, they were 4.3 times more likely to have a substance use disorder, i.e. be diagnosed with a substance use problem 12 to 14 years later when they were followed up. So the research is very, very consistent in this area. When we look at mental health issues, this is a list of meta-analysis. So if you look at depression, for example, and you take all the best studies, the highest quality studies that look at the relationship between depression and childhood trauma, and you bring them together, that's a meta-analysis study. And the findings are looked at collectively in terms of what they tell us. So this is a slide that was put together by Filippo Varese. He's a colleague at Manchester University. He collected the best meta-analysis, and what this slide tells us that in all of these areas, there's a strong and proportionate link between exposure to childhood trauma, childhood adversity, and the likelihood of being diagnosed with one of these conditions later on. So bigger the exposure to child adversity, higher the risk that you'll develop depression later on in life. Same for all these problems. And I would say this tells us that the wrong question to ask is, what's wrong with this person? What's their diagnosis? And the right question to ask is, what happened to this person? Because all of these things we call mental health problems, all of these mental health diagnoses, I've worked with all these things. And in every single case, almost every single case, when you ask the right questions, people tell you about pretty awful things that have happened in life, or that they're going through very, very stressful times in their life right now when you're working with them. So these things are expressions of distress. These things are expressions of not coping. These things are not the sign of a brain disease or faulty brain chemistry. Maybe there is a change in your brain chemistry associated with going through a really stressful time or having a traumatic experience. But we have a lot of evidence in all these areas that they're related. The risk of those problems is related to exposure to adversity in childhood and traumatic stress. For example, 70% of voice hearers, people who hear voices, start hearing voices after a traumatic event. Another symptom of psychosis is paranoia, which is my specialism, psychosis. I never worked with anybody who was paranoid who hadn't been hurt by people a lot in their life. So the fear of other people hurting them was completely sensible, not a sign of madness in any way, a survival strategy. So we got to move away from trying to work out what's wrong with people and start thinking about what's happened to them. If we look at, so we've looked at addiction, we've looked at health harming behaviours, we've looked at mental health issues, all related to childhood trauma. Let's look at homelessness as an example, because that's another serious problem that we're facing in society. This paper looked at 29 studies in a systematic review and 20 studies which were meta-analysis. Sorry, 20 studies in the meta-analysis. Collectively, what they found by looking at all that research was that adverse childhood experiences are pretty much ubiquitous in the homeless population. The lifetime prevalence was 89.8%, whereas in the general population, it's 50%, say they've had one. And 1 in 10 people in the general population in England and Wales say they've had 4 or more. And in this population, it was 53.9% had 4 or more. So far higher rates of adversity in people who find themselves homeless. The general population estimate below there is a kind of global estimate. But basically, the conclusion was people that end up homeless or sleeping rough had consistently reported adverse child experiences growing up, and that was associated positively, so increased risk of suicide, suicide risk, suicide attempts, major depression, substance use problems, becoming a victim of crime or violence in adult life, and ultimately experiencing homelessness. So people that are homeless are, there's this myth that it's a choice. I've never met anybody who was homeless who had chosen that. Often it's a consequence of not coping, of being in distress, of not being able to deal with their mental health issues, their relationships, lots of reasons. But ultimately, we've got to look behind that, and we've got to ask ourselves what happened in that person's life. And then we can move on and look at physical health problems, which is perhaps less obvious. But when we look at the relationship between childhood adversity and physical illness, there's a huge amount of evidence out there. The branch of science is called psychoneuroimmunology. So it looks at the relationship between our mind, our immune system, and our nervous system, because they're all connected. And this study from Public Health Wales looked at 2,000 people, adults, in 2015. And what they discovered was people with 4 ACEs compared to people who had none, they were twice as likely to be frequent attenders at their GP. They were 3 times more likely to go to A&E in a 12-month period and have a stay in hospital. They were also 4 times more likely to develop type 2 diabetes and 3 times more likely to develop heart disease or respiratory disease. Type 2 diabetes, heart disease, respiratory disease, all are linked to a dysregulated stress response. to this premature wear and tear on the nervous system, the immune system, and this excess inflammation that occurs as a result of allostatic load. Allostatic load means survival stress. It's the burden of all our bodily systems experience as a result of an overactive stress response. There's a great book on that subject called When the Body Says No by Gabor Mate, which I would recommend. So let's have a look at the cost. So we've obviously made some sense of the human cost of this problem of childhood adversity. But what about the economic cost? This was a study that was published in 2020. Karen Hughes and Mark Bellis from Public Health Wales and colleagues did this analysis of population surveys for England and Wales. And what they concluded was that the conditions that are most strongly associated with childhood adversity, such as addiction, mental health problems, chronic illnesses like type 2 diabetes, heart disease, respiratory illness, stroke and violence, those things cost the health system in England and Wales £42.8 billion every year. So their argument is that if we can do something about preventing childhood adversity more often, and if we can actually intervene early with people that have been exposed to it sooner, then we're going to reduce some of that massive, unmanageable, unsustainable cost that we're seeing. And very often people that go and seek help for those problems, they get a medical response. They get their symptoms treated. The tip of the iceberg is the symptoms we can see, and underneath the iceberg are all the experiences that people have had that are contributing to that traumatic stress or that ongoing stress. So very often we treat the tip of the iceberg, but we don't deal with the cause. And as a result of that, these problems are chronic. These problems continue. They go on and on. People bounce around the system, getting all kinds of help that isn't necessarily resolving their problems. So we have this kind of symptom-focused approach. We very often treat the symptoms and ignore the cause. Often what people do that are in distress or in pain, emotional pain or physical pain, but in this case, let's consider the emotional pain of unresolved childhood trauma. We try and feel better, right? We try and self-soothe when we're probably not very good at self-soothing by kind of internal means. We often seek external means of feeling better. So this comfort-seeking behavior, this kind of self-soothing behavior is often extrinsic. We often look for things to help us with that. These days, it can be this horrible thing called a smartphone, where we constantly give ourselves little shots of endorphins and dopamine, and other ways, other kinds of addiction. More we might be more familiar with drugs that stimulate dopamine, usually, drugs that kill pain, usually, food makes us feel better. Sex, gambling, alcohol, smoking, they're all ways of feeling better, but it's temporary. It doesn't solve the problem. It deals with the pain, the distress, the dis-ease for a short period of time, but it doesn't last, and it's usually harmful. And actually, for some people, often that's intergenerational. They pass on that way of coping to their children and their children's children. So treating the symptoms on their own isn't working, really. It's not a solution. I've worked with people in mental health services, and I ask them what's happened to them, and they tell me they've been in mental health services for 20 odd years, having all kinds of drugs, all kinds of electric shock treatment, lots of admissions to hospital. And I was the first person that asked them what happened to them. So actually all that treatment made no difference. They needed someone to help them with their unresolved childhood trauma. So part of the solution might be we don't just look at the behaviours as symptoms, we look at them as coping strategies, and we ask people why they're in pain. We ask them what's happened to them. We try and help them link their past trauma to their current pain, and we try and help them deal with that, make sense of it and resolve it by psychosocial methods, psychological therapies, building their resilience and coping, increasing their social support, creating meaning for that stuff. And then we help them find better and safer coping strategies than the one they've been using. The example I always give for this is with food. So once people have tried all the weight loss plans and healthy eating, etc., and still haven't lost weight and are still ill because of their weight, they often get given the option of bariatric surgery. And long-term studies of people who have had bariatric surgery show that, yes, they tend to remain lower in weight and healthier on all those things they measure, like blood pressure and body mass index and joint health and all of those things. But people who've had that surgery have essentially had their coping strategy of food removed, but no one's dealt with the reason that they did that in the first place, the pain, the distress, the discomfort they're in. They go on to have far higher rates of mental health problems, far higher rates of addiction, and far higher rates of suicidal intent than the general population. Because we've taken away that form of coping, but not dealt with the pain. People who are still in pain seek pain relief. So for me, part of the solution is understanding why they feel the way they feel, dealing with the past trauma and helping them find better coping strategies. So this thing called trauma-informed practice or trauma-informed care. This book, Harris and Fowler, 2001, they were two social workers in Buffalo, New York, who were experiencing similar things to myself and my colleagues in Manchester back around that time. We were kind of asking ourselves the same question, which is, how come mental health services don't actually meet the needs of people that we're seeing? How does the system that we've got, this medical system, this psychiatric system, not take into account the impact of trauma on people's lives? And as a result, is often very ineffective. So they published that book, 2001. Myself and colleagues published this book in 2006. Don't worry, I don't expect you to buy it. It's ridiculously expensive. It's Trauma and Psychosis, New Directions for Theory and Therapy. My point being, there was a kind of people in different countries recognizing that the current way of doing things, current way of thinking about mental health problems was not working. This medicalization of human distress was too simple. So we needed to think about a more biopsychosocial approach, one that took into account life events as a contributor to people being in distress. It kind of makes obvious sense. And back then it was very controversial, but today the things we recommended and advocated in that book and some of the things that Harris and Fowler recommended are in policy, so NICE guidelines in American SAMHSA's guidance. So SAMHSA in 2014, which is a government agency, so they published this statement and this document that outlined what a trauma-informed organisation would look like. And they said it's about realising the widespread impact of trauma and understanding that there are many different ways people recover, not just treatment, psychiatry, but there are lots of ways that people become well again. And also, an organisation that is trauma-informed recognises the signs and symptoms in clients, but also in their workers, in their families, in the other people, the other stakeholders involved. And actually, it's also an organisation that responds. So you can't just know about this stuff. You have to implement it. You have to put it into practice. And that means what we do, our procedures, our practices, our policies, our guidance, our organisational way of being, it's got to reflect this science. And actually, the thing that we must also never forget is that we frequently traumatize people in services. We very often do things that make it worse for people. So actually, one of our non-negotiables should be we have to resist re-traumatizing people. And when I do workshops on this, we can spend a half an hour talking about the different ways that our services and experiences in those organizations do contribute to re-traumatizing people. It's incredibly common. It's not intentional, but it's definitely baked into the system. SAMHSA also recommended some principles, and these are really clever and really based on the science. So the first one is safety. When you've been traumatized, part of the problem is you never feel safe. You are hypervigilant to threat, and that feeling of threat doesn't go away. So if we can't provide a setting and a relationship that makes someone feel safe or promotes that sense of safety, they're not going to come to see us. They're not going to benefit. We're wasting everybody's time. We also, once we've established safety, can establish trusted relationships that are transparent. And if we're not clear with people what's happening, what their rights and choices are, and we do what we say we're going to do, we're going to just tell that person yet again that people let them down. People can hurt them. And therefore, again, they're not going to engage with us. They're not going to benefit. It's a waste of time. We also have to recognize that social support is a massive part of this recovery story for a lot of people. So we need, and we should, where we can, connect people to their peers, give people the opportunity to connect, be a part of a group, a situation where they can feel that support, feel that validation, and hear from people who've made progress. And then we also have to collaborate with people. We can't take this traditional sort of, the doctor knows best or the nurse knows best. We have to kind of be partners in that recovery process with people. We have to collaborate. We have to recognize that it's a partnership. It doesn't work. I used to say to clients the first time I met them, when I worked in the NHS, this is a teamwork situation. I've got some expertise. You've got some expertise. Together, if we work as a team, we can find a solution. We can get things to a place where you're happy, you're satisfied. But I can't do it on my own, and you can't do it on your own. So we've got to collaborate. And that requires trust, transparency, and safety. And then actually, we should also recognize that people who are traumatized, abused, neglected are often disempowered. They've often had their power taken away many times. They've not felt like they've had a voice, a choice. They've not felt seen. So actually, one of the things we need to be really careful is that we don't disempower people more. So we have to give them back their choice, their agency, their power. And that can be really healing. It can be an important part of the recovery story. And then finally, let's not create barriers by being insensitive or not acknowledging cultural issues, historical issues, gender issues, spiritual issues that matter to that person or that family. And sometimes we avoid that stuff because we maybe are worried about saying the wrong thing or appearing ignorant. But I think it's really, and I've always found it acceptable and appreciated by clients when I say, look, I don't know a lot about Buddhism, or I don't know a lot about, your culture or ethnic group, your spiritual needs. I don't know much about that. Can you educate me a little bit? Can you share with me some of that information? People are rarely offended if you do that, but we can create barriers if we don't know what people's particular needs and sensitivities might be. I've got lots of examples of that, but I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move on. This is one example of applying trauma-informed practice that I really like, and it was from the Rhode Island Department of Corrections in the United States. So Rhode Island Department of Corrections had probably the worst reputation for violence in the prison system in America for a period of time. It's a women's prison system, and very often women were being re-traumatized being in that context, and it was a cycle of violence. So the warden, Carol Dwyer, went to a talk and heard about the Adverse Child Experiences study, learned a little bit about how trauma can affect people's behavior and people's coping, and they started to have the penny drop that actually maybe a lot of the violence that they were seeing in their system was a survival response, a fight or flight response. So they decided they would look at some of the hotspots, and one of the hotspots for violence was strip searches, another was cell searches. So they gave some basic training to their staff, and then crucially, they gave them permission to find better solutions. So the staff started talking to the women in prison about stress, about adversity, about the stress response, about regulating the stress response. So they gave them a bit of knowledge, a bit of confidence, and permission to find better ways. So they started to talk to women before they did a strip search or a cell search. They would negotiate in advance. They would ask if there are any reasons why this might be a particularly difficult or distressing experience, if there's anything that might make it feel better. They tried to avoid physical restraint. They taught staff grounding techniques so they could help women stay present and calm whilst they were having these non-negotiable searches done. And they avoided these self-protective responses. It avoided these dissociative and these kind of fight or flight responses. So those things reduced because people stayed in their present here and now, and they stayed calm. And they found amazing solutions for this everyday problem that they were having. So Carol Dwyer said, we made it clear that we weren't just doing this for the prisoners, we were doing it for the staff as well. Everybody was getting sick of being on the end of violence. And when they saw it as an adaptation, a self-protective strategy, it kind of led to a more compassionate response. And in the following 4 years after that training, the violence between inmates, between prisoners, went down every year for 4 years in that prison. They also saw an unexpected side effect, which was a reduction in violence between prisoners and staff. So staff were becoming the victim of violence less often as well, because this increased understanding and these increased skills. So I just think that's a really great and simple example of how this can make a huge difference. I've obviously got lots of examples from England and the UK and Europe, lots of examples of work that we've done with various, contexts and settings and organizations. But this is an overview. I've got to kind of stay fairly high level. So the other thing we have to remember is it's not just practitioners doing the right thing. This is also about the organizational's commitment, about senior leadership buying into this and walking the walk, about how we hire and induct people into our culture and our organizations, how we measure and value change. What we measure is generally incentivized. So if we measure how many people we see in our service, people will be motivated to see as many people as possible. If we incentivize and measure quality of the relationship, we're going to see a very different pattern in our numbers, aren't we? So we've got to think about what we measure and how that incentivizes practice. Also, we've got to think about what is the training and the support that we give to our staff. Is that adequate? Do we look after the people, looking after the people well enough? And do we give them the right training and information and knowledge and confidence and skill to work with the people that they're working with, which are often complex? And then is our environment appropriate for clients and staff? Does it meet the needs? Is it conducive to what we do? And does it feel safe, both physically and psychologically? And then finally, we do need to deliver care in line with this science. We do need to have all of our workers knowledgeable and sensitive and skilled in this area according to their job. So there's going to be different levels of knowledge and skill according to the role. But this is a set of practice standards illustrated in this slide from Oregon in America, where they have been measuring the impact of trauma-informed practice in their healthcare system for a while. And there's lots of practice standards we can use to assess our services against these standards, so we can monitor progress. Every 6 months or every year, we can update our plan, look at what we've achieved, and look at the areas where we still have work to do. So it can be measured. It's very tangible. I think there's a lot written about trauma-informed care. It's sometimes hard to kind of conceptualize in a simple way, but I think it's four things. One, it's about the organization adopting that ethos that we just heard about from Samza, but also having a prevention mindset. Prevention always saves us money. It's always better for people in the long run. So if we can intervene earlier and often prevent things by investing more in the early years and in families, we're going to see a massive return. So that's one part of it. Next part of it is we have to get better at identifying the impact of ACEs, and we have to get better at working out who's been affected by them. So we have to get away from trying to constantly diagnose people, and instead we have to ask people routinely, what happened to you? Have you experienced adverse child experiences? Have you experienced physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, a parent with a mental health problem, a parent with an addiction? We have to go through the list. The sooner we give people that invitation, the sooner they tell us, and then the sooner we can give them the right help, which is actually better for them, better for their families, and also it saves money. So it's better for the system. And then we have to also get better at helping people remain well in the face of stress, become well again after stress and trauma. And that's called resilience. And the word resilience really means a collection of assets and ways of adapting that help us cope and stay healthy in the face of stress. So for me, my training was very much about pathology. It's very much about dealing with things that have gone wrong, trying to restore health to people that are suffering with mental health issues. I think we could do more in a lot of professional training to help people recognize that, yeah, fixing that stuff is part of it, but actually building resilience, promoting wellness, promoting health, keeping people in a good place, even though their lives are stressful. That's a huge opportunity that we don't make enough of, in my opinion. And there's a whole body of science around it. So I think we need more emphasis on that in our system and in our training. And then finally, some people, some service users and some staff will need trauma focused therapies. So I spent 25 years delivering trauma focused therapies to people with psychosis and people in primary care as well. But I've also experienced them myself. I've received them. So I know that the science and the experiential side of it I can vouch for. But I also know that some people aren't going to get better without that specialist help. It might be a relatively small percentage of people, but there's a very significant number of people who need that, who are currently struggling to access it. So that's something we need to get better at doing in our health system because it's not equitable. So how does this all apply in the real world? Well, I've been working, I left the NHS in 2017. My last job was clinical director for children and family services. And then I left and I kind of focused on this subject because it's always been my passion. And people would come to me and say, look, our organisation, our service, our team are struggling with the following problems. Can you help us? And these are the most common things that I've been helping people with in organisations with over the last 8 years. And ultimately the solutions are the things we should be doing. So the first one is, where do we start? Very often an organisation will say, where do we start? I think some of our staff know about this. I think we've got pockets of good practice, but I'm not really sure where we start. So part of that is doing a listening exercise, doing some sort of deep dive, scoping. We call it a collaborative inquiry. We talk to staff, we talk to stakeholders, and we find out what people's current experience and knowledge is and what they want, what they need, and what we're going to do collectively as a result. The second problem that I encounter all the time is that organisations think that their staff are very knowledgeable about this subject. When in actual fact, when we get under the surface, we find out that yes, people have heard of it, but they don't really understand it to the level that we might want, or that it's just very mixed. So the solution is to give high quality foundational training in adversity, trauma and resilience. Some organisations make that mandatory, like safeguarding, and some don't make it mandatory, but they do like everyone to experience it. I think ultimately it'll end up becoming just a standard part of our annual training because it's so fundamental to people that we work with. Third problem is we don't ask people routinely about what happened to them. And that's partly because we don't train staff how to do it and how to respond. So they worry about opening a can of worms, which is something that people say to me all the time. So we should give people some appropriate training and skills on how to ask, how to respond and what to do next. Fourth problem, lots of workers are dealing with complex clients, complex families, but they've never had any therapeutic training per se. And that's a problem because they're dealing with the most complicated people. So our solution is deliver some role appropriate therapeutic skills and concepts that give people a better repertoire so they feel that they're doing more, they feel they're contributing more to people's needs. Fifth problem is burnout, stress-related sickness. It's like the common cold of the helping roles. So ultimately, we think that if we can educate the workforce, the leaders, the managers about what does these stress-related harms look like? What are the early warning signs? How can we avoid it? How do we build our resilience and stay well doing these stressful jobs? That's part of the solution. Sixth thing, everybody's got so much work that they've got very little time to step back and reflect and process what happened. That contributes to stress-related illness, but it also contributes to just not having a very satisfactory work experience and often feeling isolated. So we deliver a model of solution-focused reflective practice, which we model and we let people, we kind of get people to understand it and experience it. And we sometimes train facilitators we support the facilitators who then support their organisations. But if we don't look after people and give them the chance to process this stuff, it becomes toxic, it becomes burdensome, they become overwhelmed with it. And then you get to a point where you've got nothing left. You've got nothing to offer the client. And you might become sick as a result of it. And then finally, I think that quite often we measure things that don't benefit staff and don't benefit service users. So if we want to incentivize change and different cultural atmosphere, we've got to measure things that matter, like relationship quality, like morale, job satisfaction, stress levels, reward, achievement, these kinds of things. They all matter. Moving on a little bit. Sorry, yeah, I'm kind of running out of time, but in terms of that, all of those problems led to our methodology. So what we do now is we have a system that's been really well evaluated. We've delivered all of these interventions in different organizations, sometimes all of them, and sometimes individual components of those things. I won't go into each one in detail. I've kind of explained the case for change and why we've developed them. But ultimately, these are the things that we do day in, day out with organizations, teams, and services. When people say, what do I do next after this awareness raising? This is the list. And we've got lots of evaluations to show impact. So that's where we got to. When we look at the foundational training, really, we want to give people an overview of the links between adversity, trauma, and outcomes, the things that we're dealing with. And we also need to give people an understanding of how resilience can help people recover, cope better, manage in a more effective way, a more healthy way. We need to evaluate that pre and post, ideally. So we want to know what people know at the beginning and want to know what people at the end. And we did this with 900 housing sector staff recently. And what we found was 93% of staff agreed or strongly agreed that the training was relevant to them and their clients. 91% agreed or strongly agreed that the training will influence their day-to-day practice, which is what we want. And 96% of people said, yeah, I would strongly recommend this to other colleagues across other agencies because it's so fundamental. So if you're going to do this kind of work, you need to really measure that it's having the kind of impacts that you are desiring. Otherwise, it's just another nice couple of hours listening to some people talking about interesting stuff. It's got to have some sort of impact. So we can have quantitative measures like the one I just showed you and qualitative measures. So we have hundreds of comments and testimonials from people saying what it meant to them. Obviously, you can read this, but this is what we're looking for, really, is that people feel that it's given them a different perspective. It's added to their repertoire a little bit, and they can empathize and have a compassionate understanding of how people's life events affects how they present and what they need. In terms of this process of asking people, I gave you my example earlier, and this is incredibly common. This study here by Survivors in Transition, which charity in Ipswich and the University of Suffolk. This is a typical quote. The study is actually of 608 abuse survivors. One of the quotes said pretty much what I said earlier on, that in 22 years, the nurse was the first person to ask them why they had experienced depression for their whole life. It's really common and really sad that people get treatment for a long time without being asked about the underlying reasons. As a result, routine inquiry about adversity in childhood is an approach that I've developed over the years. And for the last 10 years, it's been the subject of academic evaluation. So top left, multi-centred GP trial of our model of routine inquiry, funded by NHS England. Bottom left, multi-centre GP trial with UNICEF in North Macedonia. Next, if you go to the top line again, Betstart Blackpool trained the health visitors to ask women at antenatal visits about adverse child experiences, and it was overwhelmingly positive feedback from the women that were involved. The one underneath, we trained GPs in Scotland in the deep end practices, so-called, the most deprived areas. And then the next three actually are Nottinghamshire. So we worked with a public health team in Nottinghamshire, trained about a dozen services across their county to ask their clients routinely about childhood adversity and then give them the right help. And that they're still sustaining that model. We trained their staff to become trainers, and 5 years on in Nottinghamshire, a lot of services that you will go to, it'll be routine for staff to ask you about childhood adversity and what you need as a result of it. I can send, if people are interested, I can send any of these evaluations and studies over if you want to have a deeper look. Therapeutic ideas and skills. So we do this in lots of contexts. Very often one of the most common things people say to us is, I'm dealing with really complicated individuals, I'm dealing with really complicated families. I've never had any training in counselling, CBT, motivational interviewing, whatever it is. So often one of the things that contributes to people's burnout is this feeling of being overwhelmed and like poorly equipped to deal with the people's problems. So actually, there's two solutions to that. One is give people more therapeutic skills that they can apply every day. And the other solution is give them high quality reflective practice in groups where they can learn from each other and be supported by each other. And that boosts their resilience. So therapeutic skills and ideas, we've done this in loads of settings: youth offending teams, social work teams, mental health services, schools, criminal justice settings. The list goes on. But we recently did it in a randomized control trial of 100 secondary schools, which is that slide there. What did we cover? Well, these are all evidence-based techniques and ideas that we cover. And we obviously talk about what is legitimate in your role and what might be overreaching. How do we engage with somebody? How do we build rapport, trust, safety? How do we develop this working or therapeutic alliance that predicts positive outcomes, and what gets in the way of it? How do we use collaborative agenda setting to empower people and to get their engagement in the work that we're doing? What are the reasons that we use empathy in relationships? How do we do it, and how do we apply it, and how can it help build our relationship, but also how can it help de-escalate situations as well? And then we look at some techniques around breath work, regulate the nervous system, some techniques around writing, which can be really helpful in processing unresolved traumatic experiences and stress. And then we talk about cycle of change and motivation. How do people move from where they are to where we want them to get to, or where they want to get to? And then finally, solution focused or strength based questions. How do we build on where people are? How do we help them find solutions and reach their potential by building on what they've already got? And finally, how does this all affect us? And how do we stay healthy and feel a sense of reward and achievement by doing this work, and stay in a good place at the same time? Again, I can send you more information about that if people are interested. But then that leads us on to this issue of resilience, right? So how does it happen that we do this work, we expose ourselves to stress, we expose ourselves to other people's distress, other people's trauma? And how do we stay healthy while we do that? And also at the same time, how do people that are affected by stress and trauma recover? How do they use resilience to their advantage? So first of all, we have to dispel the myths. It is a myth that resilience is just about being tough, right? About getting up off the floor, dusting yourself off and carrying on. That's a bit oversimplistic. Oxford English Dictionary suggests it's about bouncing back, elasticity. I quite like that. The image of the oak tree versus the willow in the wind. One of them bends and returns to shape, the other one cracks and falls over, a bit like Hans Selye's concept of stress initially. But the one I like best is the American Psychological Association. Resilience is a process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threat, or significant sources of stress. It's about adapting well. And that means we have to take into account the impact on our body, our biology, our mind, our relationships, cultural and spiritual factors, and how all of those interact and change over time to determine how we react to those stressful events. That changes constantly, and we have to work at it. Resilience is not something we're just born with and it stays with us. We have to curate it. We have to work on it. We have to exercise those techniques and strategies and ideas and ways of adapting, and work on our relationships so that when we need it, it's there for us. So this is an example from California. They have a statewide program of ACE inquiry. They ask people in pediatrics and general practice, standard, like being asked about whether you smoke, etc. They ask people about adversity. The next thing they get is a conversation about resilience. So rather than saying, right, you need this treatment, they go, okay, you've experienced all kinds of adversity, you're going through ongoing stress. Let's look at the best science on that subject. Let's educate you about how to cope with stress and how to recover from trauma. What are the things we know? Well, the best evidence says supportive relationships are number one. People who've got good supportive relationships, they tend to get better and stay healthy in the face of stress. In the absence of supportive relationships, people tend not to get better and become harmed by ongoing stress. Then they teach people about sleep, nutrition, and physical activity as having a massive impact on your physiological, all your bodily systems, and on your mental state as well. Also on your hormones, your reproductive system, your inflammatory response, etc., all affected by sleep, nutrition, physical activity. Then we talk about mindfulness and access to nature, which are both nervous system regulating activities. If you don't know about this stuff, you don't know about it. I mean, ultimately, I learned a lot when I started investigating all these subjects in depth. And what you realize is when you empower people with this knowledge, it starts changing from I'm going to treat you and fix you and make you better to let's collaborate. I want to make you an expert in your own well-being, your own care. You want you to make the right choices for you. And some of this is about knowledge. Some of it is about new skills. Some of it is about adapting in different ways. So they're taking a very public health approach to this, which I think is fantastic. And there is loads of evidence that resilience protects us. These factors that we just talked about, resilience factors, protect us from the ill effects of childhood adversity later on. So this is a study by Public Health Wales. It was 2,500 adults, 2017, I think it was. What they found was people with 4 ACEs compared with people who had none were divided into two groups. So they found that people who had higher levels of childhood resilience were protected from having a mental health problem later in life. So people who reported low childhood resilience were twice as likely to have a mental illness diagnosis when they were interviewed as adults. Similarly, people who said in childhood they had trusted adult relationship and they had regular sports participation, they were much less likely to have a current mental illness than people who said they didn't have those things. When they asked about adult resilience, they found the same pattern. People with more resilience assets were much less likely to have a mental illness compared with people who didn't. So the more resilience factors you could say you had in your life, they seem to offset the impact of childhood adversity earlier in life. Financial security was one of the most protective things because poverty is incredibly stressful. People who said they had some financial security were 11% of those people had a current mental illness, whereas 35% who had less than a month of financial security were protected from mental illness. Final thing that I think was, penultimate thing, community engagement. So being part of a group or feeling a sense of community was also protective. So this sense of being part of something, being connected to other people was protected by about 50%. And the other thing that was really interesting, if people said they had a supportive manager, they were about 50% less likely to have a mental illness in adult life, given that they had 4 ACEs in childhood. So have a supportive manager at work is a massive factor in resilience. So I'm conscious I'm slightly behind time. I'm going to move forward quite quickly. This is a study of positive childhood experiences. It is one of the few pieces of vastly optimistic science that I've read in recent times. This study demonstrated that if people had a history of childhood adversity, they could still, in adult life, report low risk of mental health problems and high levels of healthy, supportive relationships. And what they found was that people had more positive childhood experiences off this list were protected against the negative impacts of their childhood adversity, no matter how many they reported. So people with more of these things had better relational health in adult life and lower levels of mental health issues. Better mental health, basically. So if we can promote some of these things, some of them we can control, these things are protective. And I think there was a study in Northern Ireland recently, their ACE study, and they studied benevolent childhood experiences, which is kind of another term for positive childhood experiences. And they found the same thing. People could have loads of adversity, but if they had more of these benevolent experiences, it kind of like not cancelled it out, but kind of neutralized some of the ill effects. So I think that's a really optimistic finding. I was going to tell you about the reflective practice work. That's my timer going off. I've got 10 minutes apparently at that point. Trauma-informed group reflective practice. Briefly, there's loads of evidence on reflective practice. Sometimes people in their jobs need clinical supervision, professional supervision, but these things often take a reflective pattern. But it's a proactive thing. It's not waiting until someone gets sick and burnt out. It's a proactive way of people staying healthy and learning from each other and unburdening and processing potentially traumatic material. So we kind of broadly base it on this very familiar reflective cycle that most people will have seen. And we follow this cycle, this kind of pattern. We allocate roles. Someone keeps time, someone's in the group, someone presents a case, someone facilitates. Then the person presenting the case presents the case for 5 minutes. We all listen. And then they stop talking and we ask any clarification questions for 2 minutes, the rest of the group. And then, once we're clear, we provide our responses to the person presenting the case. And by the way, the person presenting the case has told us what their question is that we're helping them answer and what they need from us. That's really crucial. Question and what they need. Then we can ask good clarifying questions. Then we provide our responses as a group to what we've heard. And the person listens. They don't respond, they just listen. They take it all in. And then when we've finished, the person presenting the case gives us feedback for 3 minutes based on what they've taken on board, how it's made sense to them, what they're going to do. And then finally, the facilitator sums up. So in 25 minutes, we can do a really powerful reflection, learning exercise, give people a sense of validation, sense of connection in a very short period of time. Often, if this is not the tradition in your service, there can be a little bit of resistance. We did this in the trial of secondary schools, and it's not a traditional thing in secondary schools or in primary schools. But we modelled it, we demonstrated it, and we asked for people to take part in the role play. And one that stands out is a deputy head and safeguarding lead from a school who was pretty resistant and was kind of saying, we don't need this, we're all far too busy, we're all fine. Why should we bother with this? We haven't got time. But we persuaded him to take part and he brought a case example and we followed the process. And at the end of it, the guy was really emotional. And he said, that is the best supervision I've had in 15 years. I feel like I've been carrying so much. I wasn't expecting that. And what we found is many of the schools that have took part in this, and we've demonstrated this process and facilitated some sessions, they've carried on running these sessions without us after the trial's finished because it's been so powerful. So this is, for me, that's a very time efficient, really economical, really sustainable practice that can bring so many benefits. And again, happy to talk to people about how that looks and how that works if you feel that's going to be of value to you or your service. Prevention, final word before we finish, prevention is possible. So we can't just keep picking up the pieces. That's clear. Mark Bellis and colleagues did this study, the English ACE study, and they did some calculations and they put forward that if we could prevent adverse childhood experiences for the next generation, we would see 38% less unintended teenage pregnancies, a third less cannabis use, 60% less crack and heroin use, half as much violence and half as many people going to prison, which is incredible. Not only the kind of human benefits of that on society, but also the economic benefits of that. That is possible. But in terms of how we achieve it, there are lots of public health bodies in the world, like World Health Organization, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, all of these different organizations. they've produced reviews on preventing adverse childhood experiences. And there's some broad agreement, really. The broad agreement is it's got to be a cross-sector commitment. It's got to be a connected effort. There's no single agency that can fix all of this. We've got to focus on prevention where possible. We're advised to invest in child and family wellbeing and parenting programs. We're advised to detect and mitigate ACEs more effectively. So ask people routinely and then give them the right help sooner. And then also promote resilience across the life course. So these are, if you look at these global health reviews of reacting and responding to adverse child experiences, they say it's preventable. Solutions are often in the early years. We're going to get better at asking people what happened and give them the right help. And we've got to promote resilience. So that's the recipe. My final 2 slides. My recommendations to services and systems. We do need a cross-sector commitment. It's no good being a single organisation that is working really well in this way amongst a whole system of organisations who are not interested in this. So it's got to be a cross-sector commitment. If you're going to embark on a large-scale programme of change and introduce this work, start by listening to your stakeholders, your workforce, your clients, people who've got a vested interest, and co-produce a plan. Then make sure that everyone's got basic knowledge about this so they can understand that adversity and trauma affects physical health, mental health, and social outcomes, and your performance at work and how you parent. So it relates to them as a person, but also as a professional. Then train some people how to ask about adversity. You know, if we don't ask people, they tend not to tell us, and then we just treat the symptoms and ignore the cause. Give some people, where possible, some extra skills that they can use to make them feel more competent and more capable and make their jobs more satisfying and bring more benefits to clients. And then let's look after the people looking after the people and provide cheap and effective group reflective practice. It's not rocket science. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but it's very doable in the real world. And then measure the right things, you know, prove that we're making an impact. This is my final slide. I want to say to you that amongst all of these things that we're doing, relationships are the best medicine. That's like ancient wisdom and modern science together. Harvard Grant study, the top one, looked at a group of people, a bunch of people, a cohort of people for 90 years, and then their offspring as well. And the study's in its 90th year, I think. But what they found was the things that predict how long you live and how happy you are primarily the first and most powerful factor is relationships. And relationships and how satisfied you are with your relationships were a better predictor of how long you will live and how happy you are than your social class, your IQ, your genes, your bank balance, how many exam qualifications you've got, what you drink, what you eat, what you smoke. Relationships were the best predictor of longevity and happiness, particularly in middle age. In terms of recovery from PTSD, relationships are probably the most important resource. Without them, the chances are you'll struggle to recover. What else do we know? In terms of psychosocial interventions, which is often, you know, is the business of many of us here today, psychological and social support for people. Lots of studies on what makes a difference. And actually, over the last 50 years, the single most consistent predictor of positive impact of psychosocial interventions is the quality of the relationship. So people who say, yeah, my relationship with the person helping me, you know, counselor, mentor, advocate, whatever, is positive, those people tend to make benefits and recover. The people that say, yeah, my relationship with that person who's helping me is neutral, tend to make no significant change. And the people who say my relationship with the person helping me is unsatisfactory, they get worse. So they're actually harmed by working with somebody who's appropriately qualified and experienced because the quality of the relationship is not there. And on that note, if the relationship is what matters, we're doing all this stuff, we're doing all this incredible, important work, we're learning about things, we're getting better at our jobs, and, you know, we're looking after each other. But fundamentally, we can have all these tools and techniques, but ultimately, if the relationship is not the vehicle for change, and we can't have that as the medium for change, we're not going to be very effective. About 50% of the benefit of psychosocial interventions and human interactions in a helping context is down to the quality of the relationship. So therefore, if we don't look after the people who are looking after the people, we diminish a huge amount of our potential for helping people get better. And that is why I always finish with a quote by Irvin Yalom. He wrote the book Love's Executioner and Other Tales of Psychotherapy, which I read in my 20s when I was training to be a psychologist. It's a beautiful book. I recommend it. He's a really famous psychotherapist. He talked on page 119 about every year he got new students in his class at university, and they would always ask him the same question. What is the secret? How come you've been so successful? How have you become so wise? And what, what do we need to know about becoming a brilliant professional, someone who helps people recover? And he said, well, there is no secret, but I have this rosary. I have this mantra that I repeat over and over every single day because I don't want to forget it. And he said, it goes like this. It's the relationship that heals, the relationship that heals, the relationship that heals. So on that note, thank you very much for your time and attention. If you want to get hold of me, LinkedIn, Instagram, email, if you scan that thing in the corner, you can sign up to my newsletter, which I haven't done for over a year. So, but there is one coming out. So I'm not going to bother you, is what I'm trying to say. Anything but. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for that. That was